Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Daily Crypto Byte. Today is Tuesday, February 1st. We got the start of a new month here, and we've got some, relatively interesting looking charts here. It looks like today could be a potentially pivotal day for not just Bitcoin, but for traditional equity markets as well. As we go live here, we're getting some pretty interesting price action. So excited to dive into some charts today. Also got some news to cover as well. But CJ, how are you doing today, my friend?
Doing good, Monty. Really an interesting turn just now in the traditional markets. They opened up green, now coming back a little bit red. NASDAQ down over 1%. VIX is still green a little bit, plus 0.7%. So that's quite interesting. But overall, yeah, a lot of interesting equity charts to take a look at. 10-year is up quite a bit. Same with the 30-year. So those rates, I think, are definitely putting a little bit of pressure on traditional markets. But excited to dive into that and more. Also want to look a little bit at Luna today. I really like that project fundamentally. I know there's been a lot of FUD around UST and a potential depegging or whatnot, but I do believe that a decentralized stablecoin is essential for the space. And I do believe Luna on the Terra station is, a fantastic product. But when something goes from, 25 cents to $100 in 1 year, like it can easily pull back to $50 or even $20 and then rally to like something like 200 or 400. So I still believe in Luna in the long term, but just want to kind of take a look at it today as well. How you doing today, Monty?
I'm doing well, CJ, doing well. Excited to hear what your take is on Luna because, like you said, that has been, susceptible to some recent FUD with that whole Wonderland debacle. But I think there could be an interesting buying opportunity given the fact that it has given back so much ground. So excited to hear what you got to say about that. But I think first we should start with the traditional equity markets because those seem to be kind of dictating everything right now. So you want to dive into some charts?
Yeah, let's pull them up. All right, so starting with the S&P here, this is what I was a little bit concerned about from the bullish perspective is, you highlight top of the range, essentially midpoint of the range and range low. We are rebounding after that TD sequential buy 9. Lot of area of demand down here in the 4,300s. Unfortunately, what is a little bit concerning from a bullish perspective is just the fact of we turned down today after opening a little bit up. Nothing detrimental yet, but as you can see, we are running into a little bit of pressure on the 0 line as resistance in the RSI there, as well as that leftover resistance from the previous midpoints. You see a very similar pattern as well in the NASDAQ. That's something that's been highly correlated with Bitcoin, so it's obviously going to be taking a little bit of heat, but you can see 0 line turning down, just a rejection at that particular level. Until we really can break above this level, I'm going to be hesitant to jump back into a long trade and to be bullish on equities necessarily. I do think there's a chance for markets just to kind of do nothing and maybe the VIX potentially increases a little bit or just kind of stagnates. But overall, that's kind of the view. Let's take a look at DXY. Surprisingly down a little bit today after reaching that TD sell 9 just a couple days ago. Now retesting a local support level. So we'll see if we get a bounce from that. But in general, the DXY being bullish has been a rather bearish thing for traditional equities as well as Bitcoin. Looking at treasury yields, we're continuing to increase. We've really had a lot of difficulty, or specifically the market has had a lot of difficulty increasing and going risk on when you have these broader trends in the treasury yields. Obviously, it makes it less attractive to be in stocks and more high risk assets when we have things like the 10-year as well as the 30-year testing previous highs and testing previous resistance levels. We'll see if we top out here. It's quite interesting, but if these continue to go up into higher levels, it's going to be difficult for the stock market to ultimately rally. So just something to keep an eye on throughout this next week or so. Going over to Bitcoin, not a whole lot of price action, whether the stock market has been up or down. I mean, we've really just been grinding sideways on Bitcoin. not a lot to do, right? Like we're still not above the breakout level of the descending trend line. And there's not a whole lot to trigger a short trade either if you really wanted to take a stab at shorting to the bottom of this range. So not a whole lot to do, but definitely interesting noticing like traditional equities and actually seeing them down this morning. We'll see if they rally back towards the end of the day. But Monty, any take on just the market in general right now?
Yeah, CJ. First of all, I think you're right. I think we're going to have to really keep an eye on what we're seeing in traditional equity markets today. I think that will ultimately dictate whether or not we can climb higher in Bitcoin or we do get rejected at that sort of downward sloping channel that you pointed out. And I think in many ways, today is kind of a tipping point for Bitcoin. On the daily chart, we'll be minting a TD Cell 9 tonight, also coming up against that, potentially up against that critical 40K level. And for me, unless we get back above that, it seems like we're heading back down to retest the lows. But ultimately, I do want to just give some kind of a little bit of perspective here, because there is some interesting data from both Sentiment and Glassnode that are providing some confluence here. And one thing that is super important to watch is kind of the exchange flow data. And whenever we see Bitcoin moving off of exchanges, it tells us that we're kind of running out of that speculative short-term holders. They're selling their Bitcoin. It's going off exchanges into the long-term holders, into cold storage wallets that are typically the stronger hands. So when we see large flows off exchanges, it tells us that the sell pressure is kind of being mitigated here. We're running out of sell pressure essentially from these short-term holders. And when we have these peaks, that often coincides with tops. When Bitcoin's moving onto exchanges, we often see relative distribution from the long-term holders into those short-term speculators. And as a result, that typically is when the market's overheated, when we're making a top. That's what we saw here when we peaked in Bitcoin flowing on exchanges. But since then, it's been moving off, telling us that people are either selling or becoming more long-term holders and don't have any intention to sell. And like I said, we're seeing a very similar thing if we look at Glassnode's data. This is a more zoomed out perspective, but as you can see, we've actually seen very, very strong outflows from exchanges into cold storage wallets over the last 2 to 3 weeks here. And if you just look at the chart, this typically coincides with periods of accumulation, of consolidation before we make climbs higher. So, this really differs. This most recent price action differs from what we saw in the summer of 2021, because there is not the same amount of inflows. We saw such significant inflows back here in 2021. We saw significant distribution from long-term holders. We're not seeing that now, telling me that the market dynamics are different, and ultimately there's going to be less sell pressure and therefore perhaps less need to consolidate for this long period of time like we did last summer here. So the fact that we're seeing Bitcoin flow off exchanges is a historically bullish metric, but ultimately, there could potentially be more sell pressure coming from these exchanges, because as you can see, in the past here, just last October, when we were seeing kind of similar price action, liquidations, retail traders capitulating after buying this, lower high here, we continued to see exchanges or flow off exchanges until we kind of were propelled higher and ultimately made these new highs. So I'm watching for kind of when this peaks here. It could be soon. We could see a continuation if we break below that 36K level. But ultimately, I'm encouraged so far by the fact that we've seen supply absorption from the long-term holders at these critical levels. So one last thing I'll say in terms of Bitcoin, this is from Will Clemente's Twitter, is the Bitcoin entity adjusted dormancy flow. CJ, I'm pretty sure you've referenced this chart before, but this is a good way to kind of look at whether or not whales and long-term holders are moving their Bitcoin. And as you can see right now, they're not, and it's giving us this buy signal. So again, we saw this happen back in 2021 during, right before the beginning of that, second leg pump. We saw this signal here. We're seeing it again now, telling us that old coins aren't moving. Much of the sell pressure currently is coming from short-term speculators and new participants in this space. So lots of metrics telling us that, sell pressure doesn't have too much more, left to push price down. That being said, we're kind of teetering on this critical level here. And if we don't see continued supply absorption at 36K, then perhaps we could even head back down into the 20s. But for the time being, we're seeing that supply absorption. We're seeing, the whales willing to step in at 36K. And until that changes, we have a relatively solid price floor. So that's just some encouraging data. But, in the interim, it does look like we're kind of at the whims of the traditional equity markets. So got to keep an eye on those for sure.
Yeah, without a doubt. That I remember that was one that we had pointed to a couple weeks back as well. That was like a bullish macro trend indicator. There's a lot of bullish macro trend indicators. For instance, the NVT, network to value transacted, that's been oversold. There's only like 3 or 4 times in Bitcoin's history where it's been at these oversold levels. And then historically, it's gone on to rally. So like if you look at the macro indicators, certain ones for Bitcoin, like you had just shared with the dormancy flow, Monty, oftentimes right now they are pointing to like oversold levels and an optimal time to accumulate Bitcoin for the long term. And, I do question, where are the remaining sellers going to come from in the market? But at the same time, if the equity market is not able to rally here and just kind of chops and potentially even retest the lows, I think Bitcoin's obviously going to be at the whim of that. But with that being said, let's get on to kind of a free trade setup, Luna, and just kind of what we're seeing there. So I guess I'll first start by saying, I already did say this, but I love the Terra ecosystem, long-term bullish. I think this thing can climb to $100 again, eventually, potentially even 200. So, I do like this as a long-term bet. Even to potentially start like buying a little bit at the current price point. But the one thing that I have to say, or the one thing that I would approach the market with, if you were to consider buying Luna for the long term here, is it's kind of like buying Bitcoin at 6K in 2018. Whereas, now in hindsight, it looks like an amazing buy, but you had a lot of pain to sit through first. And, Luna has had such a tremendous uptrend. I said previously in Bitcoin, like it's hard to find like the remaining sellers. Obviously, there's still a lot of people who hold Luna from levels down here and are still up very much on their investment and could potentially consider selling if we see more downside action. But overall, the absolute low I would look for, and this would be the equivalent of like Bitcoin falling from 6K to 3K in 2018, would essentially be like Luna falling and then bottoming out roughly at this $25 level. So that would be the ultimate downtrend that I would look for. It doesn't mean we have to get there necessarily. Let's talk more about a shorter term time frame. So if we continue to see weakness in the equity market and crypto markets, I would look to play this range right here to the downside of Luna. So we define the range, range high, range low, essentially the midpoint then. And as you can see, after rebounding from our upward sloping trend line, we have gotten rejected a little bit at that midpoint of the range. So overall, I'm going to be looking to play this. Let's zoom down to a little bit more of a micro time frame. I'm going to be looking to play this if we break down, retest resistance, and then are rejected at resistance. That's the short trigger. Once you see the confirmation that resistance is forming, then you can look for downside triggers or targets of potentially, $40 or even $35. Now, broadly, I think we're going to have to see a lot of macro weakness in order for something like that to happen. But, it definitely is a possibility to the downside. Now, let's talk about upside potential. If we are to see something kind of like a consolidation along this upward sloping trend line, perhaps a break above, I would look for bullish continuation in that particular case as well. The thing is, it's just, we've had such an amazing uptrend with Luna. We are a little bit oversold. We are turning up from oversold levels. So, I would look for either two of those scenarios to play. But overall, that's what I've got. Monty, any final words today?
I just think it's going to be, like you said, CJ, much of what is going to happen with Luna and Bitcoin is contingent on what we see in traditional equity markets. So I think that's going to be really important to watch today. As always, we'll be hanging out in the chat. So if you guys have any questions, you can drop by at marketrebellion.com/try crypto. You can try the first week for $7. We got a pro charting service, 24/7 chat with a community of traders from all around the world. Watch list, education curriculum, a whole lot more. We publish actionable trade insights. So definitely head over there and check it out. And please like and subscribe on the way out. It really helps our channel. But that's all we got for today. Join us for our members only Doge of the day right after this. But have a great rest of your day. We'll see you again tomorrow. Take care.